Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Celldweller, Satellites. Damn, I almost didn't think we were gonna get this. I know that's how I just opened that Future Sound of London review I did a couple of weeks ago, but that counts several hundred times more for Celldweller. I really didn't think this album was gonna be a thing. If you don't know who Celldweller is, I'll admit it has been a very long time since I last talked about this guy. His last album, Offworld, came out in 2017, and I did a video on that with the full and brief segment. Also before that, I did a video on one of the albums under his synthwave-focused side alias Scandroid, and have probably made a few passing mentions of him here and there, but basically, Celldweller, aka Klayton Albert, or just Klayton, is maybe the closest to a straight-up metal artist that I feel like I can actively consider myself to be a fan of. He's undoubtedly still an electronic artist that falls squarely within my typical reviewing boundaries. The way he combines all the chugging metal riffs and distortion with electronic soundscapes, drum and bass, and grand science fiction concepts, with a pretty solid ear for catchy hooks on top of that. It made his stuff feel markedly more approachable to me, even as someone who has very strong reflexive anti-metal bias. I have tried to fight that bias over the years. I've listened to a lot more industrial music and the like since 2017, and feel like I'm at least marginally more educated on the scenes that Celldweller is partially inspired by. For example, I know the difference between My Chemical Romance and My Bloody Valentine now. And I'm going to continue to do my best to fight my inherent, sensory biases against these styles for the sake of giving wider breadths of music more of a chance. But I don't think that bias is ever fully going away, even if I know it's just this primal sensory reflex in me more than anything. I'm still never going to be the kind of guy who, goes out of his way to listen to music where the point is to be brutal and aggressive and loud and noisy like that, especially if it's centered around guitars and not synths. The closest any artists, electronic or otherwise, that have come to qualifying as metal without that bias kicking in are Porcupine Tree, Coma Duster, Pendulum, and I guess The Prodigy, if you want to stretch even further. But all of those feel like a bit of a stretch to some degree. They're artists that have clear influences in metal, but don't really fit in that scene on their own. Even when I sat with the entire Nine Inch Nails catalog earlier this year, there's a band who's much closer to the metal scene than any of those artists, and combines metal with electronic and ambient styles in a way that I hoped I could get into. And they did have albums I liked, but I still feel like they're more of a band that I respect from a distance than one that I actively enjoy listening to. I mean, the NIN albums that resonated the most with me were the two ambient projects they just did over the pandemic, and not any of the actual big fan favorites like Downward Spiral, which seemed like not a great sign for the level of depth of my fandom. But that's also why, even if I don't exactly put Celldweller on very often either, I still at least feel like I can call myself a fan of his, because my favorite work of his also feels like the stuff that is most widely representative of what he's really known for. I feel like I enjoy his stuff for all the same reasons that his dedicated fans enjoy his stuff, and not just random parts of it. I feel like the core appeal of his music actually does connect with me instead of, again, just kind of appreciating it from a distance. And I think the main element that got Celldweller to connect with me where a band like Nine Inch Nails didn't, it really just comes down to one thing. I feel like the primary appeal of Celldweller is just to have fun. Trent Reznor always takes himself super dead seriously, and that's not to say that approach couldn't also lead to lots of really compelling stuff, but Klayton is way more likely to lean on the goofier, nerdier, and campier side. He's never taken himself all that seriously, and that could help the Prodigy and Pendulum-loving side of me to connect with him. Especially when it came to his Wish Upon a Black Star and End of an Empire albums, which I marked as honorable mentions in my retrospective year-end lists for 2012 and 2015, respectively. I did have my issues with Wish Upon a Black Star when I returned to it, re-listening to it for this video. It is not a smart or deep listen in any capacity, the kind of thing that I might have thought was trying to sell you on some kind of greater story or plot, which it doesn't really have. And the lyrics can occasionally be kind of cringe, especially when he tries to write about women on tracks like I Can't Wait or Tainted. Maybe he hasn't aged that well. But the lyrics really aren't that important in the big scheme of things. What's most important is the production, the propulsive grooves, the hooks, the fact that everything goes so hard and sounds so badass and cool, while also being really fucking goofy and ridiculous underneath all of it. It's pure camp, and again, just trying to be dumb fun at the end of the day. And End of an Empire is an improvement upon that album in every conceivable way. A properly great project in what I personally believe to be Klayton's strongest work. Another loose concept album with surprisingly in-depth world building involving traveling to cities on other planets and robot uprisings or stuff like that, I don't know. There isn't actually a plot to this one either, despite hints at one, but it does feel like you're being taken into the world of some, like, Xbox-era shooter video game set in space, like Halo, Metroid Prime, maybe more recently the Destiny games. It's kinda just meant to be like a mindless fun time kicking the ass of some evil, oppressive alien empire or something, while also kind of low-key doubling as a generic metaphor of rising up against the injustices of systems in the real world. Side note, I also changed my mind on the track Heart On. Back in 2017, I thought that track was the corniest shit I'd ever heard, and I have a heart on for you was a line I thought was so bad I remember needing to pause the track and say fuck you out loud. But coming back to it now, it is much more clear to me that that track was always meant to be a self-aware joke from the start. Perhaps even directly making fun of those cringier moments on Black Star, going out of its way to be the most comically unromantic love song possible as a bit of a self-dunk and tongue-in-cheek admission that he was never good at writing about relationships like that to begin with, before going on to never write another song like that ever again, as far as I know, and honestly, I can respect that. Outside of that, I do remember not really caring for his self-titled debut. I did briefly preview through that one, and it was better than I remembered, even though it still reads to me as like a less well-produced or catchy version of what he'd go on to do later. And his fourth album, Offworld, pretty much stand by what I said in my review of it, in that it probably would have been better if it weren't treated as a main Celldweller album, since it felt so tonally different and lower stakes than any of his other albums under the name. But as far as like a quick little collection of emo ballads went, it did work for what it was. And it does actually make a bit more sense as a main album with the further context of this latest album, but I'll get to that later. And obviously none of that is to get into his compilations of electronic trailer background music and the soundtrack to the Voices in My Head series, or any of his work under other aliases, like his above-mentioned synthwave material as Scandroid, or his more abstract and ambientish material as FreakGen, which reveal a lot more of his appreciation for the world of electronic music in particular, or his more rock and metal-centric work as Circle of Dust, which I still have never gotten around to listening to. But I'll admit, while I do definitely consider myself a fan of Klayton's, I'm also not the most in-depth follower of his either. He's a prolific artist to be sure, but his catalog looks a lot more intimidatingly big on the surface than I think it actually is. So many releases he has on his Bandcamp pages are like teaser singles, remix projects, unfinished demos, other supplementary material to add on to the main events of his albums. The guy knows how to make everything he does have a lot of fanfare, but it does mean that just because there is a lot of fanfare around something he's dropping doesn't mean it'll be something new that I'll be really interested in. Hence why I don't personally pay close attention to everything he releases. And his Celldweller albums in particular nearly always have ridiculously drawn-out release schedules. Wish Upon a Black Star was supposedly in development hell a full 8 years before it finally dropped in 2012. End of an Empire had all but like 2-3 tracks already released by the time it dropped, mostly through a series of 4 teaser EPs. And this latest album was not only first announced to be a thing all the way back in 2018, but all 8 tracks on the album were released as singles in the interim. For fans of Klayton who were paying attention to him this whole time, the only track they wouldn't have already heard before the album's release was the closer, The End of the World. I am personally not really a fan of this release strategy. I wanted to not feel like I'd spoiled the entire experience for myself whenever that album finally dropped, and that only gave me more of a reason to not follow him super closely. The only track I'd heard from this album before it dropped was My Disintegration. Heard that one a single time back when it first came out, remembered liking it, but didn't attempt to form any more specific opinions on it. And given his track record for albums taking forever to release, whenever he would vaguely hint at this 5th album being a thing, my mantra was always, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. Now, to be fair, this album being delayed all the way into 2022 wasn't exactly all according to Klayton's plans. I've been told by one of his fans that there were tons of behind-the-scenes troubles and random things happening in his life within that time that spurred this on, from getting married and having kids and the usual pandemic stuff, to an attempt to move to LA and set up a new studio that ended up way more cramped and difficult to work in than his previous space, and that studio itself nearly got burned down by the California wildfires, all resulting in him eventually just moving back to Detroit. Honestly left me feeling like a bit of a dick for having made fun of his release schedule, but oh well. Point is, the wait finally ended a few weeks ago, Satellites dropped its final single, and I finally heard the full project in its entirety and let it sit with me for a while. And final thoughts on it is, yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's not really anything too out of the box from what he'd already accomplished under the Celldweller name in the past. You're not going to get anything you wouldn't already expect, but it does his usual sound just as well as always. The same mixes of chugging metal guitars and banging drum and bass grooves that all hit really hard and with plenty of solid vocal hooks to go along with it. It's admittedly not the kind of album that leaves me feeling like there's a lot to break down within it, but I don't really have much to complain about it either. The fact that every track was a single probably didn't do it major favors for some of his longtime fans, but that's not to say that this feels like a mere compilation as a result. All these tracks do feel like they're leading into each other. There's a number of moments throughout the project where the lyrics of a track directly reference the track that immediately came before it. There's a semi-coherent arc formed by the whole thing. It feels like this was the manner in which all of these tracks were originally meant to be presented all along. Not to mention, I mean, maybe you can take me with a grain of salt on this, but I feel like this is Celldweller's best written album, like from a lyrical level. See, back in the old days, Klayton's lyrics would be a lot more simplistic and on the nose. He'd made tracks like Gift for You, which were the musical equivalent of
Merry Christmas. A little birdie told me you'd like this.
But it feels like he has more something to say here. There's a lot more genuine feelings put into his writing, with no moments that they feel like they're being really on the nose. Maybe aside from the track Electric Eye, with the one moment here which decided to take the album title literally, and fittingly is the oldest track of all of them, first released in 2017. Though even this track's worst crime at the end of the day is feeling a slight bit out of place in context. I'd still actually mark that one as one of my favorites. But I think the rest of this album is treating like the whole idea of Satellites more as a metaphor for feeling like Klayton's life has gone out of orbit, as it were, and the whole thing is more of a rumination on his own struggles with depression, the need to be a better person in a world built on unjust power structures and lashing out against said power structures. In that way, the whole album is built as a direct mirror to his Off-World album, and a refinement on the themes he was exploring there. Off-World itself was a very 2017 kind of album, in that 2017 was the prime year to feel defeated and just mope about the state of the world. There were so many albums out that year, from Depeche Mode's Spirit, to Chick Chick Chick's Shake the Shutter, to Erasure's World Beyond, that all centered around the same subject matter, approached with varying levels of tired defeatism. And Celldweller was just yet another example, feeling the need to create an entire album of mopey ballads for his own self-comfort. That's not a judgment against any of those albums either, by the way. I mean, it was just an optimal time to mope. But Satellites is a continuation of those ideas approached in a more active and constructive way. It feels like he's in a similar headspace, just frustrated at how the systems of humanity are failing and going through a lot of personal troubles, though it's obviously less mopey and more actively frustrated, verbalizing that frustration in more specific and wordy ways than ever before, talking about feeling disconnected from the world and into the void, going off against those in power who misuse it to get people to fight against each other in Blind Lead the Blind and A Matter of Time, going off on his own personal demons and mental struggles with My Disintegration, Soul Parasites, and Baptized in Fire. Soul Parasites in particular being a metaphor he comes back to a few times in later tracks, I guess as symbolism for the things eating away at his mental health. And finally culminating in The End of the World, which pretty sums up all the feelings he's expressed over the course of the entire project, even directly referencing Off-World in its final lyric. That track may be particularly bleak, being about feeling like we're in the end of the world and all, but what I like most about that track is the set of lines right near the end where he just slightly changes the hook. I can't believe it's the end of the world, I won't believe it's the end of the world, I don't believe it's the end of the world. Just that subtle progression in wording there that still implies at the end he's not given up hope yet and is still willing to fight. That's a really good sentiment to close the album out, I feel like. I really like that. And sure, there's plenty of over-the-top moments, as metal lyrics tend to have, but it does feel rather direct and personal and realistic, even. I never really came to Celldweller for his lyrics before, but I do have to give him credit for his writing here. I do feel like it's noticeably stepped up here from what he's done in the past. I mean, if I have any particular issues with this album, it's the fact that it runs together a bit, instrumentally and sonically. I do like all 8 of these tracks and would have a hard time picking least favorites. They all have propulsive grooves and solid hooks to back themselves up, plenty of varied textures from heavy guitars and crashing beats to various wubbing electro synths, and even some acid synths and some trance-influenced textures in the background. Every track is really visceral and produced really cleanly to make these grooves surprisingly really easy to get into, even despite my usual preferences against this particular style, and can be really fun despite how heavy the subject matter can get. But I will also admit I happen to be markedly more drawn to the even-numbered tracks over the odd-numbered ones. Blind Lead the Blind is my favorite track on the album, mainly for having easily the catchiest hook and sticking in my head the most, but it also has like a lot of cool progressions rocketing between all sorts of different metal and electronic passages. I mentioned Electric Eye was one of my favorites. That's specifically because it's the most overtly electronic cut in the bunch, with a much more straightforward pendulum-esque drum and bass beat. Even if it is a little out of place, I'm still more than happy it's here to break up the sound of the album a little bit. And The End of the World also stands out for having more consistently present lead melodies than a lot of these other tracks, and the kind of more ballad-centric vibe of it, even though it is heavier than a lot of the tracks off of Offworld. And the other even-numbered track is My Disintegration, which maybe that one just went out as a highlight thanks to my having heard it that one time before the album release, but it does happen to have one of the strongest hooks as well, some of the more interesting progressions that like have the track slow down and speed up, some riffs that kind of vaguely remind me of the Trigun opening theme, I don't know. I don't really have specific things to say about the odd-numbered tracks. They're very fundamentally similar ideas. I guess he kinda raps on A Matter of Time, which his rapping is just his metal voice but really fast spoken and doesn't feel as out of place as you might think. He does that on a bunch of other tracks too, though. I went back and forth between that one and Baptized in Fire as the here, but again, both are good. A Matter of Time is a kinda weak and unmemorable first half, but there's some breakdowns and choruses at the end that I really like. While Baptized in Fire, I guess, is the most traditionally metal track here and the one that most set off my usual biases, even when it still feels like an important climax point for the album. And Soul Parasites would be a candidate for least favorite due to its near-complete lack of a tune during the verses. Although the chorus is one of the stickiest choruses here, so I don't know. And I guess Into the Void was probably the biggest grower on the album, went from being kinda ambivalent on it to marking it as one of my favorites. Didn't really have much else to note about it, but yeah, I mean, that's about all the analysis I have on this album from an individual track basis. As for how I feel on this thing as a whole, I've gone back and forth a lot with it. I do think it's all around very good, and it's right on the border of greatness for me, though I'm not sure if it quite reaches that level for me. I suspect the usual anti-metal biases might still be playing into that, since, like all Celldweller albums, this just isn't the kind of thing that I see myself putting on regularly. Even if I have a lot of fun whenever I do, I gotta be in a specific mood for this kind of thing, and I don't really listen to this kind of music casually. I've also found it's not a great idea to listen to this album while reading Twitter. I did it a couple of times, and as we're in the middle of an Elon Musk takeover, this album just made me feel that much more pissed off and further intensified my bleakest feelings. It's not exactly what I would call a feel-good listen, but at the same time, this album has gotten better and better the longer I've sat with it, and I do think at this point I could probably say it's about on par with Wish Upon a Black Star. Possibly even a tiny bit better. Like, that album was better varied and had some high points that have stuck with me longer, like So Long Sentiment and Against the Tide, where this album is markedly sameier, but it's also much better written and more mature in terms of the lyrics. It's got roughly equally as good hooks and production, and it is obviously a much tighter and more consistent listen as well that has none of the slightly embarrassing lower points that Black Star had. So, I guess take that all as you will. I'm sure it'll resonate a lot more with his core fan base than it did for me, assuming the dragged-out release schedule didn't ruin it for them. Though I do think all of these tracks are better taken in fuller album context than they are as individual pieces and work together really well. So there's still merit here for those who'd already heard pretty much the whole album through the singles. And even in spite of my usual not-for-me feelings that I have with all albums in this particular genre, as well as the hunch I'm probably not going to be putting this on super often in the future, I'll still hang on to it anyway. I can definitively give this album my thumbs up. I'll say it's worth hearing for anyone interested, and I will give it a very strong 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
They try to stand on solid ground when the earth is shaking.